Hey, this is X-Cult Baby, and after what I know has been at this point pretty much a 2-month hiatus, I am finally back. Many of you already know I used to be a Jehovah's Witness. I was born and raised in the religion and left it when I was almost 19 years old. If you want to get the full story on that, there should be a card up in the corner linking to the video where I have explained my story of coming out of the Jehovah's Witness religion. When I left the faith, I still believed in it, I just wasn't accepted as a member anymore. It wasn't until I realized that I didn't have any good reason to believe that any gods existed before I stopped believing the specific religion that I had been raised with. Now, on the video where I told my story, and on many of my other videos, I often hear from faithful Jehovah's Witnesses in the comment section. Some people make the claim that I know there's a God and I just want to sin. Some say I just didn't read the Bible correctly, or pray enough, or have enough faith. And there are a handful who legitimately empathize with the situation that I left, but for one reason or another think that just because maybe there was a few bad apples in the organization, that doesn't discredit the truth of the religion. So, for those people who have given their own reasons as to why they think that I actually left as opposed to the reasons that I actually gave, here is a video about some of the research I have done, essentially explaining that if I ever become a theist again, I'm not going to be a Jehovah's Witness ever again. Because even if the Bible were true, even if Christianity was true, even if there definitely is a monotheistic God, it's not the one the Jehovah's Witnesses believe in, because that religion is totally debunked. Reason number 1, the global flood. Of course, Jehovah's Witnesses are not the only Christian group that teaches that there was an actual, literal, worldwide flood as depicted in Genesis, but it is part of their belief system, so it definitely needs addressing. I'll be the first one to say that trying to scientifically disprove miracles in the Bible doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because miracles are supposed to be impossible, right? But, just for the sake of that, the part of this story that is a global flood could happen is not the part that I am going to try to disprove, just for the sake of that argument. But the fact is that with such an enormous, catastrophic, worldwide event that should have happened only a few thousand years ago, there would be a massive amount of geological and biological evidence that we just don't see. If the flood had happened, even if the Bible had never been discovered, there would be scientific papers all about a worldwide flood that had happened, because the evidence would be paramount with or without a Bible being involved. Yeah, if there were only 8 human beings left to repopulate the Earth, and those people, for the most part, were related to each other, yeah, scientists would know that there was a teeny tiny bottleneck of human genetics at some point in our history, and again, that just doesn't show up in the evidence. And the same would be true for all of the animals, especially the ones that there were only 2 of. Speaking of the animals, how exactly do all of them fit on the ark? Jehovah's Witnesses, among many other creationists, teach that only a few kinds were needed to create the biological diversity that we see today. But if that were true, we would be talking about extremely rapid evolution that is not supported by science. Actual evolution requires millions of years, but the kind of diversification and a speciation event that would be required to make the flood happen would just be ridiculous. And then let's get into the practical part of this. Regardless of whether or not they can all just fit on the ark, how are 8 people supposed to take care of all those animals? I've worked at a zoo. There were probably a lot less animals in the zoo than there were on the ark, or maybe even about the same. I don't know. Depends on if you think that they were kinds or whatever. But it requires a lot of people, and a lot of space, and a lot of time, and a lot of resources. it requires food that would most certainly rot and would need plenty of storage space. I mean, we're talking about over a year's worth of food for a diverse group of animals and people, not to mention fresh water. And obviously, it is terrible zookeeping practice to try to cram a bunch of various animals from various environments into one area. And I'm sure they didn't have anything to replicate their ecosystem in that little box. I'm sure that it was just, I mean, if it was real, it would have just been a few stalls per animal. That just doesn't work. Not to mention, where does all the feces go? The way that the ark is described, it only had like a little window for air and light. The people would be suffocating in there from all the methane buildup, and it would reek all the time. And how are they getting all of that out? It's not like all the animals are using a toilet or a litter box. It's just kind of everywhere, presumably. And if you want to say that maybe God was miraculously taking care of all of these issues the whole time that the ark was going, why did he even bother having people put animals in the ark in the first place if it requires that much divine intervention to make it work? Why not just, bring the animals back after the fact? Just snap your fingers, and you'd only have to do one miracle instead of like a gazillion. And that's not even talking about all of the animals outside the ark. Marine animals can't just survive in any old water. I mean, ask Vice Rhino about how picky some of his fish are about their fish tanks. They need specific temperatures, specific pH levels, depths, saline contents, a variety of things. One giant ocean that covers the whole Earth is not going to meet those biodiverse needs for various marine animals. And what about the plants? I mean, the Bible says that there was already like full-grown trees as soon as the floodwaters receded. How? How would there have been time for entire trees to grow and for the grass to grow back? I mean, what were these animals eating as soon as they got off the ark? What was anybody eating? There wouldn't be any vegetation left. And again, if God just decided to miraculously preserve all the plants, why didn't he just do that for the animals too, instead of going through all this ark business? There are even more problems with this story, but it is so, on so many levels, the story of the global flood is so impossible that I thought it was worth bringing up. Number 2, birthdays and holidays. There's plenty of evidence in the Bible that the God of the Bible is not particularly cool with his people worshiping other gods. That much is clear. But Jehovah's Witnesses completely ignore the context of all of that with their rules about birthday celebrations and other holiday celebrations. Think about it this way. In the Bible, whenever God is telling Christians or the Israelites or whatever group he calls his at the time to steer clear of false worship, he's not talking about accidentally worshiping. He's talking about deliberate participation in worship of other gods. He is telling them not to participate in what they would know was worship of another god. Nobody in the Bible is ever accused of or punished for, as far as I know, accidentally participating in false worship. Many of the holidays and rituals and other traditions that supposedly are pagan in origin that Jehovah's Witnesses are forbidden from participating in are largely viewed as secular now. The vast majority of people who are celebrating holidays aren't doing so because of a specific religion. I mean, if atheists celebrate Christmas, which they do, we do, why couldn't another Christian? The vast majority of people celebrating their birthdays, too, are not doing it because of some superstitious spiritual tradition. They're just doing it because it's a cultural tradition. The vast majority of people who are celebrating these holidays are not doing so as an act of worship. And if you, as a Jehovah's Witness, participate in these holidays and are not doing it as an act of worship, then neither are you. You can't accidentally participate in false worship. I mean, what god would see you doing a ritual that happens to coincide with a holiday of theirs, but if you're not doing it with any intent, why would they accept that as a worship offering? That's meaningless. I actually do a whole video on this topic of holidays and birthdays and such. That will also be linked with a card in the corner and in the description. Number 3, disfellowshipping. Obviously, the word disfellowshipping is totally made up and not found anywhere in the Bible, but that's not even really the point. There are so many verses in the Bible that totally contradict this teaching that Jehovah's Witnesses have about disfellowshipping and shunning their family and friends and any ex-members. My friend across the sea, Lloyd Evans, of the John Cedars channel, actually did a video where he basically compiled a list of Bible verses that are in complete contradiction with the disfellowshipping arrangement. I have that linked in the description because he does a way more thorough job than I could do just covering a point-by-point bullet list of things that I don't agree with the witnesses. But if you want to know more about that and ponder some of those scriptures and some of those ideas for yourself, definitely watch his video. And if you don't have 45 minutes to spare to watch his video, he also wrote a blog article about it, which you can read at your leisure. If I were to summarize, a lot of the verses that he cited are about loving your enemies. And obviously, even if you consider someone who is opposed to your worship or has left your worship an enemy, you also can't love that person from a distance. There are also a lot of verses about loving your neighbors, loving sinners, and just being merciful. And to any reasonable person, shunning a family member or a friend is not an act of love, obviously. Jehovah's Witnesses have to completely distort and redefine love in order to make disfellowshipping loving. But the facts are, you cannot show kindness and love to someone you are actively avoiding. In my personal opinion, if there's any scripture that debunks this teaching, it is the parable that Jesus tells of the prodigal son. It's found in Luke chapter 15, and yeah, in my opinion, that on its own is enough to debunk this teaching. I mean, in the first place, Jesus gives this parable in response to being criticized for keeping company with sinners. If that in and of itself doesn't tell you what the point of this story is supposed to be, I don't know what will. In the story, the son returns to his father's house not because he's sorry for anything that he's done, but he's sorry that he's run out of money now. But regardless of his reasons for returning, the father embraces him with open arms. He doesn't even wait for the son to get close enough to explain why he's come back before he's running to greet him and kiss him. And again, can I emphasize, Jesus is telling the story specifically to counter criticism that he is keeping company with sinners. I don't know how this story could be more clear. How can you help someone and show love to someone who you do not interact with? It doesn't make sense. And as I said, there is a lot more scriptural evidence for this, but for me personally, if I were a Bible-believing Christian, that story would be enough to debunk the disfellowshipping teaching. Number 4, their stance on blood. First of all, obviously the laws in the Bible about ingesting blood have nothing to do with a medical procedure that involves blood transfusion. This law was written way before such a procedure could even have been conceived of, and it obviously was not written with that in mind. I mean, the witnesses themselves do say that many of those laws were written for a specific people at a specific time for a specific reason, and it seems like broadening that reason to include blood transfusions is a huge stretch. And of course, they have their apologetics about the sanctity of life and how that is a biblical principle that still stands regardless of the specifics of the laws. That's very ironic, because if the Bible is teaching you that life is so sacred, why on earth is your religion basically asking you to be a martyr? Jesus makes it pretty clear throughout the Gospels that the nitty-gritty details of the law are not what is important. The law was made to benefit people, not the other way around. He routinely cured people on the Sabbath because the law was never set in place to prevent human well-being. And I use the word well-being very specifically, because we're not talking about people that have life-threatening conditions. Some of the people that he healed on the Sabbath just had problems that caused them pain and suffering, but were not life-threatening. We're not even talking about life-saving miracles here, just life-bettering. At Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 16, Jesus heals a woman who isn't able to stand up straight. Of course, he's doing this on the Sabbath, so the presiding officer of the synagogue tells Jesus, totally correctly, he tells Jesus, well, you could have healed her on another day that wasn't the Sabbath. And you know what? Jesus calls him a hypocrite. The point of this is obvious. Upholding the finer details of biblical law over a person's well-being, let alone their life, is wrong. And as I said before, it's already a stretch to say that the biblical laws about ingesting blood have anything to do with blood transfusions in the first place. But this principle makes it very clear that even if that were necessarily true, if somebody needs a medical procedure that may save their life or may give them a better chance of surviving, that comes before the law. Proverbs 21:3 and Hosea 6:6 sum it up pretty well. Basically, God doesn't want your sacrifice if your sacrifice comes at the cost of doing the right thing. Number 5, the last days. Okay, it's 2020, so right now it does kind of feel like the world is ending, right? Yeah, kind of, but you know, there have been bad times and good times throughout history, and just because we're going through a bad time right now doesn't mean it's actually the end of the world. All that stuff in, like, 2 Timothy chapter 3, for example, is so vague. It seems obvious, at least in the context, that the writer isn't talking about some far-off, distant future. They're talking about the near future, if not the current time when it was being written. I mean, if you took the list of things, you know, lover of money, selfish, no natural affection, whatever, if you took that list and got in a time machine and went back in time pretty much any time and just pulled a random person over and said, do you think the world is like this? They'd probably say yes. I mean, people see the bad stuff happening around them, but they don't have any point of reference for the good times and the bad times, you know? The world's constantly changing. And talking about more end-time scriptures, the context of Matthew 24 also makes it pretty obvious that Jesus is describing a time that is coming soon. He's talking about the fall of Jerusalem, not the end of the world. And if he was talking about the end of the world, that would actually make it even worse evidence, because as far as wars and famine is going, I mean, the world is actually getting better in that regard, not worse. The amount of hungry people in the world is steadily decreasing. The number of wars we've had in the last 100 years are significantly less than in the 100 years preceding. There have actually been more recorded earthquakes in the last 100 years, but those numbers fluctuate constantly, and there hasn't been a steady growth. It's up and down. The point is that so many of these things that are supposedly the signs of the end are things that have been toted for hundreds of years. People going, oh, the end is soon, because look around you, isn't it obvious that the world is ending because of all these signs are coming true? People have been saying that for thousands of years now. And so far, every single one of them has turned out to be wrong. Why would the witness's end-time prediction be any different from anybody else's? Especially since it's based on pretty much all the same scriptures. Number 6, because I still use American Sign Language, 1914. To me, now, looking back on the Bible math that witnesses do to arrive at that year is just ridiculous. If you have to take a verse in Daniel and interpret that using a totally unrelated verse in Ezekiel and another totally unrelated verse in Revelation, and God meant for you to do that because that's the only way you could put all the numbers together correctly, he's just a bad communicator, because that makes no sense. And even if all of that somehow was exactly how God wanted you guys to put the numbers together, and he did all of that intentionally, and all the math added up, the witnesses would still be wrong, because 1914 wouldn't be the correct year. Because their math is based on a very incorrect date. They teach that Jerusalem fell in 607 BCE, and that's a very significant point on their timeline of Bible math events that gets them to 1914. But that's not what the historical data says at all. In fact, it's not at all controversial. I mean, historians largely agree that it was 587 BCE when Jerusalem fell, not 607. So even if their math was right, the numbers they're plugging into the equation are still wrong. The year 1914 has no biblical significance, and it's a cornerstone of their doctrines. So that's a pretty big piece to take out of their doctrines. Well, there are my 6 points for you. If you are a faithful Jehovah's Witness and you're watching this video, please do not take my word for any of this. Seriously, don't take my word for it. Watch this video, think I'm a liar, and go look up all of this information for yourself. Do your own research and make up your own mind. Normally when people say do your own research, it's because of a conspiracy theory, so that sentence is kind of triggering, but you know what I mean. When I say do your own research, I don't mean look at the dark web or YouTube. I mean read documents. Listen to actual historians, actual scientists, people who have literally dedicated their life to know what they are talking about. And, of course, a lot of this stuff is stuff that you have to interpret for yourself, like the rule with the blood and stuff like that. That's all stuff you have to figure out for yourself. I'm not a Jehovah's Witness, and I never will be, ever again, because that stuff just doesn't add up. If there is a true religion out there, it's not the Jehovah's Witness religion. I'm Xcult Baby, reminding you to go free yourself. Thanks so much for watching, viewers. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like, leave a comment letting me know what you think, subscribe and ring the bell to see more from me in the future, and share this video with anyone who might enjoy it. My social media links and my email address are in the description if you want to contact me or follow me on any other platforms. An extra special thanks to all of my patrons. I really appreciate your generosity and support. If you'd like to support me and this channel, links to my Patreon, PayPal, Amazon wishlist, and Teespring are all in the description. Thanks so much for your support.